Welcome to the lecture for Module 2 on realism. In this lecture, we're going to talk about realism as a theory of international relations, discuss some of its basic assumptions, offer some criticisms, and also provide a concrete example of its application. To begin, realism is kind of a catch-all term for, generally speaking, two variants over time. The first of which is classical realism. Classical realism is based on the assumption of human nature that people are naturally self-interested and prone to conflict. And this is often associated with theorists and scholars like Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, and so on. The more recent variant of realism is called neo-realism or structural realism, and as the name suggests, it reflects our ideas about the structure of the international system and how that affects how states behave. It's also important to mention that within structural realism, there are two different variations. One is offensive realism and the other is defensive realism. Offensive realists argue that states are likely to engage in maximizing their power and expressing their dominance, threatening other countries, trying to take over other countries, because that is the best strategy to survive in the international system. Whereas defensive realists posit nearly the opposite, that the dominant strategy in this uncertain and fearful international environment is for states to take a step back and avoid engaging in these aggressive behaviors so that they don't welcome conflict. Okay, so let's talk about a few of the assumptions that undergird this very prominent theory of international relations. First, the state is the main actor, which means that realists don't really care about individuals, they don't care about transnational actors, they don't care about ideas really, they primarily care about nation states. Also, states are unitary actors, which means that they act as one when we're talking about the international stage. So there aren't two different state departments, there aren't two different presidents, there aren't two different militaries, there's typically one, and the whole country moves together as such. Another is that, borrowing from economics, decision makers are rational actors, which merely means that they undertake actions intended to achieve their goals. Another really important assumption is anarchy, which is not craziness or chaos, but rather that the international system is one in which there's no higher authority. So that means that there's no government above the nation state that can compel it to comply with international law, treaties, and so on. Another assumption is power over morality. Power is the currency of realism, and so countries will, under what realists believe, engage in maximizing their power in order to survive in the international system, as opposed to thinking about their moral obligations and how they should behave because of the ethics of the international system. Another assumption is that the structure of the international system is dictated by the distribution of material capabilities. So basically, who has things like guns, large militaries, land mass, the size of their economy, and so on. And so this results in several different types of systems. A unipolar system, like the United States has been for quite some time, a bipolar system, which was current during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, or even a multipolar system in which there's many different powerful countries like there was arguably during the 17th century. And then finally, realists focus primarily on issues pertaining to security and conflict. They don't pay as much attention to issues like human rights, the environment, or international trade. Under realist thinking, states have a couple of different strategies that they can employ in order to manage their insecurity. One is balance of power. So if you think of a scale, then you might think of the fact that countries can form alliances which will strengthen their ability to ward off enemies. Another strategy is deterrence, which is demonstrating a country's resolve to use force. So attacking a country in order to demonstrate that you still have power, you have a strong military, and that will dissuade would-be countries from attacking you. Another thing that's relevant here is the concept of the security dilemma, which is a situation in which countries will strengthen their military, and in so doing, they will pose a threat to other countries. And this results in a ratcheting up of the insecurity that countries feel, and it results in a kind of spiral by which countries continuously strengthen their military capabilities, posing a threat to each other. Some of the criticisms that have been levied against realism include that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if we believe that people are naturally self-interested and prone to conflict, then that's exactly the kind of world we'll get. that it's excessively pessimistic, and that actually most of the time countries are usually cooperating. We see less conflict, especially now when there are very few interstate conflicts relative to, say, the number of internal skirmishes or civil wars. Also, realism failed to explain the end of the Cold War, which dictated that a bipolar system like there existed between the United States and the Soviet Union was a very stable one that was not likely to end anytime soon. Another criticism is that it's too focused on states when we know that there are other actors and other kinds of forces or mechanisms that can influence international affairs. So an example of where realism could be useful is in thinking about NATO expansion, NATO being the Regional Security Agreement or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which, if you're listening to this in 2023, recently expanded its membership to include Finland, much to the ire of the Soviet Union. So realists think that institutions don't have independent value, they merely reflect the interests of the dominant powers. And in this case, the United States still maintains its position as the world's preeminent authority in the international system. And so the argument that realists would make is that NATO has long outlived its usefulness, but because the United States sees it as a bulwark against maybe the abilities of Russia to engage in war in Europe, that's why the United States continues to support it and keep it around. So for a realist, institutions are not something that have an independent causal impact. They reflect the interests of the powerful states, and that's why they keep them around. So NATO, as an example, is a tool of American power, if you're a realist, not independent from American power. And that's realism in a nutshell.